In the midst of the current trade conversation, one of the things that we often get told to do is that why are we so focused on the United States? Why aren't we just trading amongst ourselves as the African continent or look in other parts of the world? But the conversation about Africa is always brought on the table. And I think it's relevant for the South African agricultural sector because, after all, when you look at our exports to the world, yes, they are just few touches under 14 billion US dollars a year. And when you think about which market is the largest, the African continent accounts for roughly half of our exports. But it's not all over the African continent. The biggest market that we send our agricultural exports to is the Southern Africa region. I would argue that in those exports to the African continent, 90 cents in every dollar is to the SADC region. So that's the important area for us. And when you ask yourself why SADC, why aren't we expanding to other areas? There is a proximity and the distance and the infrastructure advantage that is there. But also when you look at the profile of the products that we send to the continent, you'll see that it's largely grain. There will be apples and a few table grapes, and of course vegetable. And there will also be some meats that go there, but it's not as in large proportion of fruits and wines as what you would see with what we send to the EU. Because the EU is an important market, for example, for fruit and wine. And by the way, the EU accounted in 2024 for about 19% of our agricultural exports. So when you think about the high value product, which are also labor intensive, which are those commodities that when we think about the expansion in South Africa, we always say, let's expand more on a high value and labor intensive commodities, because that is where we need more people to be working and the economy in rural South Africa to be as vibrant. And those are the products that go to the EU. Consumers there, they have the buying power, but it's also more of what they actually need. The region that I would say it's much more diverse, when you think about Asia, we have our beef in Asia, our wine, as well as the fruits. But that's the region that we still have to penetrate more. If you think about the South African agricultural export and the tariffs that they face in the likes of China and India, those are some of the agreements that we need to reach into saying, can we get a trade agreement? Can they lower those tariffs? And yes, that's the conversation that China has been putting on the table. But South Africa is yet to cross the bridge where we can actually see what that engagement will look like. But the African story that we are always getting told that we need to be focusing on, it's important, but I will argue that it is more about maintenance. Although we are much more dominant in the Southern Africa region, you could say, can we expand in East Africa? Can we expand in West Africa? And also what's happening in the northern region, the Maghreb region, where you have Asia, Tunisia, and the others. When you think about the agricultural trade of the North Africa region, it's much more stronger with Europe and the Middle East than the Southern Africa region. The only time where we really began making sure that we are increasing our exports, it's a recent past, whereby we've seen our maize going to Egypt and a couple of few other commodities. But it's not the market that we view it as having a much bigger growth potential because of the demand of the products that they need. There's a distance issue, and that's what I would categorize when I look at that market. But also think about the products that they produce and think about what we produce. Yes, the import bill is large, but Egypt's import bill is dominantly wheat. It's not some of these products that we want to send to the market. And of course, there could be seasonality thing where there are a flow of some products, but I wouldn't typically see it as the growth area. In West Africa, you face a couple of things. There are infrastructure constraints. There are also aspects of regulations. If you consider grains, for example, in maize, as South Africa, about 85% of our maize is genetically modified crops. By the way, it's no reason to cry about the genetically modified crops. They are safe for consumption. But they've also been of excellent benefit to South Africa. If you think about when we started planting the GMO crops, that was back in 2001. Since then, up until to today, The yields have improved. We used to have about 2 tons per hectare then, but right now on rain-fed, the average ton per hectare on maize in South Africa is over 6 tons per hectare. So we've actually seen the yield gains. And in fact, the area that we farm for maize over time has declined. But if you think about the output, it has increased. And of course, that improvement is not only the aspect of the genetically modified crops. The genetically modified crops are in addition to better farming techniques and the other technologies. But the point is that they are the dominant seeds that we use in South Africa. So when you think about exporting to some of the other African countries, take Kenya, for example, they've prohibited the imports of genetically modified crops as well as the planting. So that is one hindrance, which I would categorize it as a non-tariff barrier. But there's a much more on the standards and the regulation that actually discourages trade, but also the consumer demand as well as the purchasing power. Average consumer in our continent, unfortunately, doesn't have the buying power that you find in the EU, you find it in the US. And when we think about the profile of the agricultural exports in South Africa, we are big on the fruit, which is what we want to expand for the jobs as well as the value that it brings to the sector. And of course, wine. And the other important commodity that we are growing more is beef. Because if you think about it, beef is important both for transformation, but also just the capacity that we have to expand as South Africa. Of course, that is after we have resolved all of these animal diseases aspects that we've been talking about. Then that's the industry that still has the capacity to export and expand more in South Africa. But that will need a consumer that has the buying power. Then there are long talked about issues that are related to infrastructure, certain levels of corruption, payments issues. Those are all of the things, unfortunately, that are not pleasant to talk about, but certain businesses do see this. And that increases the transaction cost of just doing business in the continent. And that's something that we need to resolve and we need to focusing on as the African continent to say, how do we iron out those issues so that we begin to be a much more vibrant market as well as there's an increase in inter-trade when we're thinking about the African continent. Because the money is there and the continent does spend on agriculture. If you think about the continent's import bill for food, we spend over 80 billion US dollars a year. And of course, a large part of that is the North Africa region because of those wheat and the other products. And then you'll find that about 45 billion US dollars each year is the Sub-Saharan Africa region. But again, the profile of those products, it will be wheat, it will be vegetable oil, maize, and some grain. That's the constraint that we tend to face in South Africa, which is why then when you bring the aspect of saying, let's trade more with the African continent, we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. That is awesome, but for the medium and the long term. And I think in the near term, it's very important that we secure the markets we have elsewhere. And that is why then also the US aspect becomes very important to say, look, there are tariffs now that we are facing. They are painful to certain businesses. But I think the policy approach that the South African government is taking is an important one. And it's the path that we desire, or I desire myself, which is that try to continuously work to mend the relation with the US. Because those farmers that are down in the Western Cape, they still benefit on that market. Either they are in citrus, table grape, ostrich products, nuts in the Mpumalanga and KZN. That is an important market for them. And I think at the same time as we are doing that, then the conversation about China, the conversation about the Middle East, India is important. And I will underscore the point that we have said several times that those are not replacing one another, but rather in addition. Because the important thing to always remember about South Africa and this whole conversation about exports, because I've seen some of you saying, what is this obsession about the exports? Can't we do something, sell some of the products amongst ourselves? The key thing is that the businesses that produce, they have to still remain profitable. And what they export is not the products that they are taking out of the domestic market. They have the surplus, and that surplus must go somewhere so that these businesses remain profitable. And when they are profitable, they are able then to employ and keep the jobs that are there. Because we have in agriculture and its value chain, roughly close to around about 1.3 million South Africans that are there. And I think everyone would like those South Africans to still have their jobs. And I think that is why it's very important then that we export for the financial sustainability of the business, which is for the good of keeping employment and keeping the rural economy of South Africa to be as vibrant. And we talk about the exports because we still have probably in the next 5 years or so a potential to have an increase in output of our fruits, which is roughly about 30% or more, just on the trees that the farmers have already planted. And that fruit, we are not going to just take it all to the African continent. That's why then that conversation about China opening up more, India opening up more, as well as the Middle East, those get to be the addition while we are retaining the market that we have in the US and elsewhere. That's the logic and really the high-level thinking around this whole conversation about the exports. It is part and parcel of the growth agenda in South Africa. And in fact, I would even argue that without a deeper access on trade, you won't have a thriving and a successful agricultural sector that we have, because trade is an important catalyst on growing the South African agricultural sector. And that will involve then new markets lowering tariff, addressing non-tariff barriers. And while we will shout about that when we are engaging with China or India, I think that as the African continent, the harmonization, removal of now some of the non-tariff barriers is one of the aspects that we'll have to do. It's a one thing to lower tariffs as part and parcel of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But to ensure that there's a much more stronger inter-trade, aside from the issues of the buying power and the consumer preferences, we have to ensure that at least there aren't some higher transaction costs that are related to regulations and how we think about certain products. If we could normalize and harmonize some of those, then as incomes begin to improve in some areas of our continent, and the consumer taste changes and aligns more, and then there we will start to see trade taking place in a much more robust place in agriculture. But with what we have, though, this is all not to say the African continent is not important. We have to work hard to retain what we have in the Southern Africa region. And that involves both the leadership in government and those that are in business interacting more with our trading partners in the Southern Africa region, maintaining those relationships with those folks because they are important, just like we do with the EU. Because the EU exports aren't necessarily more important than the exports that we are having in the Southern Africa region. All of our trading partners are important. And by the way, I'm not sure how many people know this, but our South African agricultural exports to the EU, they are valued the same amount of our exports to the SACU region. So if you're looking at it in the monetary perspective, aside from just the composition of the baskets of the products, then all of these markets are important. And I think that maintaining a warm relationship with all of them is what, as South Africa, we have to do. Because as we search for new markets, there's always a temptation to get excited with the new markets, with where we are facing trouble, to the extent that we forget that we have to touch base with some of the markets that we already do business with. And I think that is important for us. So African continent, Europe, Asia and the Middle East, the Americas, and many other parts of the world are what keeps our agricultural sector going. And exports are at the center of that. And with that, folks, let's leave it there for the week. Please share the podcast and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.